if what we're being told, that 400 million people are quarantined and are not working, it's a thermonuclear bomb on society.
Hey friends, Sean from SGT Report here. Thank you so very much for tuning in. It really means a lot to me. Hey, before we begin this interview with Bill Holter, just a quick shout out to this interview's sponsor, PatriotRates.com. Stop paying for overpriced insurance. How many of you guys are just tired of paying too much for auto, health, and life insurance? You can cut your insurance rates substantially and save big with PatriotRates.com. It's an American insurance company you can trust, and it's owned by veterans. Patriot Rates sources competitive pricing on auto, health, and life insurance, and they'll always have your back when it comes to finding the best quote to fit your needs. There's no obligation. Just give them a shot and see if you don't get the best rate you've seen in a long time. So visit PatriotRates.com for a free quote on auto, health, and life insurance, and stop paying for overpriced insurance. That's PatriotRates.com. I'll leave the link below this video. Friends, thank you so much for tuning in. It's great to have you back, and it's wonderful to have back on the line my friend, my longtime friend, a real friend, Bill Holter from JS Mindset. How are you, Bill?
Good, Sean. Thanks for having me back.
Hey, great to have you back on, buddy. Hey, just a real quick note about true friends, about the search for truth and real news. Isn't it interesting that guys like you and I that have known each other for so long, and so many of my other real YouTube friends out there, we don't infight, and we don't always see eye to eye, but we're willing to have dialogue and explore issues in a rational, polite way. And I, for one, have no time for infighting. You and I have seen it in the space with friends that we have, Dr. Dave Janda and others, being attacked by people in the space. I don't have time for it. You don't have time for it. What do you think it is that makes trolls tick, Bill?
I have no idea. I mean, I don't think like that, so I don't really understand. I don't get it. Some people get so hardened in their views, there is no other view. I don't know.
The way I view it, Bill, is that we're in an existential fight for the very soul of our nation, right? It's a battle for the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. It's a battle for sovereignty versus open borders. It's a battle for truth and honor in the American way, and the alternative is giving up and not voting in November, choosing the side of anarchy and allowing a Marxist to get into the Oval Office. And then you know what we get, Bill? We get a new world order, we get open borders, we get George Soros talking points, and we eventually would get a one world government. So you have to look at this stuff pragmatically, in my view, and the alternative to President Donald J. Trump in November is a Marxist.
Well, it's light versus evil. Broken down, that's what it is.
I should explain to people, too, we've got you via phone today because we're having some trouble with Zoom, so it's great to have you back. Well, let's do this. Let's talk about current events, and let's talk about the dangers of this coronavirus, now being called COVID-19. I think I heard Mike Adams, who I have a soundbite to play for you in a second, call it the ninja virus. And it's really scary because the numbers in China, the numbers of deaths, are now spiking. This according to even the Chinese government, which has tried to cover this thing up and make it sound like it's not as bad as it is. So I want to talk to you about supply chain, financial ramifications of this thing in just a second. But first, let me play the soundbite from Mike Adams, who is making the argument that not only is the coronavirus bad, the mortality rate is far, far, far higher than the Chinese are letting on, which is the only thing that explains them shuttering factories over there. And then that'll lead right into our conversation and your point about the financial ramifications. Here's Mike Adams.
So is 2%, is that a high enough death rate to justify the draconian crackdown measures that the Chinese government is currently invoking? And my assessment is that it can't be just 2%, because 2% wouldn't justify all these actions. Because the Chinese government, in doing all these quarantine crackdowns and shutting down society and having the economic losses and all the people dying at home from other causes that normally they would get healthcare, but now they can't because the hospital beds are all occupied and so on. If the death rate were only 2%, this quarantine would make no sense. It would be overkill for a 2% death rate. You would have fewer overall deaths to have no quarantine and just, from their point of view, let 2% of the population die. Because 98% survive, and the economy keeps running, the hospitals keep running, and you don't have secondary deaths and tertiary deaths and so on. So a 2%, just to summarize, a 2% death rate is not possible to be reconciled with the level of crackdown that we are seeing right now.
I'll pause it there. Bill, he goes on to say he believes that the death rate is far closer to 15%, perhaps higher. This all leads back to your point, an email to me about the supply chain and the financial ramifications of this thing. Do you want to lay that out for folks?
Sure. Well, first off, I agree with what Mike's talking about. First off, we don't know what's real and what's not real. We're hearing stories that there's 400 million people quarantined. I mean, that's roughly a third of the total population. So do you really shutter an entire country because 1,300 people have died?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you've got to ask, and even if it turned out to be, 13,000, it's tenfold what they're saying as of now. It just doesn't make sense that they would shutter an entire country. Now, let's assume that the death rate is much higher, the infection rate is much higher, and there are 400 million people quarantined. If that's the case, the ramifications are so broad, it's mind-boggling, because China is the biggest trading partner to the world. So what this means is there's going to be bottlenecks, supply of real goods not making it to market. I mean, think about Walmart. What is the amount? I had heard a number of something like 60 or 70% of what Walmart sells is from China. Does that mean that in a month or less, who knows, their store shelves are going to become basically empty? And we're talking everyday goods, and we're talking everyday goods that have not been manufactured in the United States for years and years. So it's a real problem from the standpoint of real goods. Now let's look at it from a financial standpoint. We know that China has a leverage ratio higher than almost anywhere in the world. The amount of leverage in China, they have a leverage problem. So now you've got 400 million people that are quarantined, which means they're not working, they're not producing, commerce is not happening. If they have a leverage problem to begin with, which another way to say a leverage problem is they have a huge debt service or a huge monthly payment that they have to make, what happens from the financial standpoint? Do they declare force majeure and nobody has to pay anybody for a month or 2 months or, God forbid, 6 months? How does that work? And what are the ripples from that? Because all the debt is not just internal. The world, because of globalization, is entirely interconnected. So you really have a real problem and you have a financial problem that if what we're being told that 400 million people are quarantined and are not working, it's a thermonuclear bomb on society.
Yeah, I want to do a screen share here because I want to talk about the disconnect between equities and the real economy and everything you just said. So give me a second. I know you can't see this, but this is for the sake of the audience here. All right, Bill, we're looking at Apple stock, $325 per share as we're having this conversation. Of course, that thing has gone through so many splits. It's a multiple $1,000 stock, really. It's a $1.42 trillion market cap. Meanwhile, the reports are that their factories in China, Foxconn, have been shut down. Some reports saying that they're restarting. And the bottom line is this: what's going on in China should be having real ramifications to the stock market in this country and companies like Apple. And yet it's not. Exuberant stock markets keep going higher. How do you explain that, Bill?
Well, you really can't explain it. It makes zero sense, and you have to question you have to question the information that we have. Is it just a small drop in the bucket? It's just, a small amount of infections, and there's really not 400 million people locked down in quarantine? That would explain nothing happening to the stock. If there truly is a quarantine of 400 million people, there's no way that it makes sense. Really, the only two markets that have, and one of them only barely reflecting it, oil. We have seen OPEC is now talking about production cuts because oil demand has in fact dropped. But the only market that's really been affected would be the copper market. Copper has cratered.
Well, I don't know if you've been following palladium either. Palladium's through the roof. Meanwhile, silver and gold are still mired down by banker paper. Hey, let me share this with you. And again, making a case for real news, we over at SGT Report and so many others in the alternative news media have been far ahead of the mainstream media in talking about the coronavirus and its possible connections to bioweapons labs. It's not even a possible connection. It's a concrete and quantifiable connection. And we've been far ahead of the mainstream media in asking the question about whether or not this thing is a bioweapon. Zero Hedge asked the same question and was banned on Twitter for asking it. Well, now we have CNBC, because at some point, Bill, when things get bad enough, even the mainstream media has to start asking the right questions.
They have to fess up.
They have to, and they have to cover it. This is Squawk Box asking whether or not this thing may be a bioweapon. Listen to this.
What's the current thinking on whether this was natural or some type of bioengineered strain that got out?
I think the vast majority of people still believe that it is that it originated from the wet market.
Wrong. All right, we'll continue. That is absolutely so bogus, and everybody at this point paying attention knows that it didn't originate from a wet market. It didn't happen by magic. It happened in the P4 level bioweapons lab in Wuhan. The question is, was it released on purpose or did it get out by accident? But let's continue.
Because if you go into wet markets in China, and I presume that the one in Wuhan is the same, you do have a lot of different animals that are in very close quarters with people. It's not exactly the cleanest environment. So that is the vast majority of people believe that. But as you said, there are plenty of theories out there that perhaps because Wuhan does have a lab there, and it's a P4 lab, and there was a biochemical weapons expert who went from the Chinese military, who's there now, who was there to look at some of these testing kits and to try to expedite the availability of these testing kits. That because she is there, that maybe this was man-made, and there's a theory that it could have been a part of a bioweapons program. But that's just theory. And I also heard a counter theory, which is that this is the Americans that have created this, and that the reason for that is because the Americans want to make money off of the Chinese by creating a problem here and then creating a solution in the form of a vaccine or a treatment.
I'll pause it there. Isn't that interesting, Bill? Now, I don't think that that's probably the case, but it is interesting. Problem, reaction, solution. These big pharma companies love to have outbreaks of measles or whatever it is the problem is, and then they want to come to the rescue with a vaccine.
Well, and isn't it interesting that over the last year or so, most all anti-vax videos have been erased and taken down?
Oh, that's right. They're coming against vaccine truth channels hard. My friend Kerry Rivera has really reaped the consequences of speaking honestly about potential cures for autism, or at least treatments. See, that's the thing, Bill. These big pharma companies have blanket amnesty against lawsuits when their vaccines harm you or your children, but they don't even want you to know about potential treatments. Isn't that sick? It's one thing to have blanket amnesty and make billions of dollars off your fraudulent vaccines for which there is no safety and efficacy testing. But once they damage your kid with their vaccines, they don't even want you to have access to potential treatments that Kerry Rivera talks about.
Yeah, that's truly a shame. One other point, these cruise ships that were quarantined, the one remaining cruise ship, and I don't know what the numbers are now, but there's your Petri dish. we'll, I would think, be able to see how many body bags are taken off the ship.
Yeah, there's one I think quarantined in Japan, if memory serves. It might be called the Princess, the Caribbean Princess. I'm not sure about that, but at one point the number was 136. I bet that number continues to climb. People are quarantined. There's another ship that was trying to gain entry to Thailand, a cruise ship, and 5 countries have said, nope, you will not port in our nation. So nation states are scared of this thing. This is not, it appears to be a very, very real problem. And my question to you, we circle back, come full circle here. When does it hit the economy? Because it is a really large and very real problem.
I believe it will hit the economy before it hits the financial markets. The financial markets will follow. You know, if widgets are not being produced because people aren't working, then you know you'll be able to see that with your own eyes on shelves.
Yeah.
Lack of supply is going to be the canary in the coal mine.
Well, and let's just flush that out and let's think about that. One of the issues with what we're seeing in China is, and Mike Adams actually makes that point, and I posted that video, guys, over at thephaser.com if you want to find it. But Mike Adams makes the point that because of the draconian nature of this lockdown in China, many thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps more than that, many Chinese people are going to die because they can't get treatment in hospitals for things unrelated to coronavirus. They're on lockdown in their apartments, and many of them will die of starvation if this thing continues to go on forever. So the one thing that we need to start thinking about here in this country, for those of you listening, is preparing. I don't think it's going to get as bad here as we're seeing in China. Just on a gut level, I just don't see it happening. However, God forbid if it does, and you don't have food supplies and water to stay locked down for a month or more.
Yeah, the second point, many will die just from the quarantine itself, from lack of food. Even if they're not locked into an apartment or whatever, what about the food supply itself? I mean, people actually have to grow the food. Food is processed, food is shipped. And there are people that have to do that. So if you've got an entire population locked down, how's the food going to make it to market, even if people were out and about on the street?
That's right.
And Sean, I just want to point out that I think it was probably 5 years ago I began speaking about distribution. Now, I just spoke about distribution just a few seconds ago, that it's necessary to have people working to be able to distribute the food. But you also have to have credit. Everything runs on credit. And from the financial standpoint, if you see China going through a debt implosion, that's going to ripple all over the world. You're going to have a distribution problem everywhere in the world because credit is not flowing freely. And speaking of credit, we should probably talk about the repo market.
Yeah.
We've just, today's Thursday, every single day this week, the Fed has had oversubscribed auctions. It's the first time that it's been 4 days in a row. And you're talking 60, 70, $90 billion per night. Now, if everything, let's go back to the disconnect. The stock market, you used Apple as an example, but the stock market versus the real economy, there's a huge disconnect because we know that economies all over the world have been slowing down for, call it the last 3 to 4 quarters. And you can see that in hard numbers. Just look at the trade numbers. So there's no question that the economy was already slowing, but yet you have the stock market, equities, just continuing their grind higher. When did that start? That started, pick the day, September 14th, and that was when the repo problem began. So the repo problem is there's too much for demand for cash versus the amount of cash available. So what that's telling you is that the most basic fundamental credit, which is overnight money, is having a problem. Yet the very top of the pyramid, the most risky part of the pyramid, is continuing higher when there's a massive problem. There's a huge crack in the foundation.
Yeah.
And yet they're building the house higher.
Here's what concerns me. And it's a little woo-woo, but it's also historically based. First of all, I'd let you know that called up an article while you were speaking here, that Japan cruise ship, the Diamond Princess, evidently 44 more cases of coronavirus on the ship. One woman from Hawaii has it. It does beg the question that I've asked previously, is this thing bioweaponized to affect people of Asian descent more than Caucasians or African Americans? Well, I think we're going to get to the bottom of that answer here real soon.
Hey, Sean, there was an article out, and it makes sense to me. I mean, I don't really know how to vet it, but there was an article out today saying that the coronavirus affects smokers many times more than non-smokers, and they showed the statistics that Asians predominantly smoke more than the rest of the world, and Asian men smoke multiples more than Asian women.
Huh. Okay. Well,
So
that's interesting. Yeah.
That's just.
Well, that's interesting because then it wouldn't mean that genetically it's engineered to target people of Asian descent. It's just, I guess it's just built to maybe affect people whose lungs might already be compromised. I don't know. That's all conjecture, at least from my view. But what you just said there, I think, is important. Here's my thing about getting into the areas of woo-woo as it relates to what is coming. All right. Historically based. Recall that back in around 2010, 2011, I'd spoken frequently with Pastor Lindsey Williams. Now, Pastor Lindsey Williams worked up there in Prudhoe Bay and the oil pipelines, and he had a high-level friend he called his elite friend, somebody who really ran in these circles, these Bilderberg New World Order circles. He said his friend told him about the rise of oil to maybe 150, and then they're going to crash it down. That happened. I talked to him before it happened. Had I followed his advice and shorted oil from maybe $140 a barrel, I could have done very well. He also said that in the future, they are going to run the stock market up to unimaginable heights. Now, friends, I just want you to understand that when he said that, it was probably around Dow 10,000. I couldn't have imagined then that when he said they'd run the stock market up to unimaginable heights, and when you thought it couldn't go any higher, it would go higher still. I couldn't have dreamt that it would go from 10,000 to 30,000. Now, here we sit at Dow 30,000 with everybody cheerleading, saying the American economy is wonderful. That's why we're seeing this. Never mind the Fed. Never mind the funny money. But here we sit. And he said, Bill, he told me, when you think it couldn't go any higher, they would take it higher still. But eventually, you'd see the euro go, and then a couple weeks later, the dollar would break, and this whole house of cards would come down. Now, I share all that with people because you know and I know that eventually the end to this Ponzi scheme will come. I'm starting to wonder if perhaps this coronavirus may be the black swan that eventually allows them to flip the switch literally overnight. And we could go from Dow 30,000 to 25,000, and from 25,000 the next day to 22,000, and so forth. Your thoughts, how does this Ponzi scheme end?
It gives them something to point at, doesn't it?
Yeah, gives them a scapegoat.
It gives them a scapegoat. It gives them a reason. They can say our policies were working, except for, in the past, you would have said except for X, and now they very well might be able to say except for the coronavirus. Yeah. And Sean, I just want to mention that corporate profits in the U.S. are the same today that they were back in 2014. And in 2014, what did we have, a $13,000, $14,000 Dow?
Yeah, I've got it right here. We were around 15,000, 16,000 on the Dow.
Okay, so what's happened is you've had corporations borrow money, basically ruin their balance sheets, and they've used that borrowed money not to put into new productive, efficient capacity. They've used it to buy their stock back.
That's right. So I have the single best example of that, Boyd, is, oh boy, you got me fired up on that one. The single best example is Boeing. Right now, as we're speaking today, Boeing is a company that instead of putting money into infrastructure in research and development of new, better planes, they modified existing planes to come up with the MAX, which now cannot fly, and they're all grounded. Meanwhile, despite the fact that Boeing has had no new orders come in January, and despite the fact that they've got billions of dollars in exposure to the grounded airplanes problem, that the stock is at $346 a share, $195 billion market cap, still trading near all-time highs, Bill.
Right. It doesn't make sense. I mean, there's an example of a stock that should have broken. Look at another industry to look at. Look at the cruise ship industry. I mean, what is it? Royal Caribbean, I looked at that. The 52-week high was, I think, 150, and the 52-week low was 110, and here it is 115. Why is that thing even trading close to, the highs versus trading at a level equal to the value of their boats, or a value below the level of their boats? Because if this thing does spread, and if this thing is in fact real, for what, 3 months, 6 months, however long, I mean, this is going to put a serious ding in the mentality of people who want to cruise. So they'll be running these things around less than half full.
Yeah. You make a great point, and it sparks another thought here, because we know the nature of these run them up and then crash them cycles that I think are all manufactured and done by the elite. But you and I probably both thought that the crash would come sooner and then they'd run it up again. Here's my point. I've got that stock up, Royal Caribbean Cruises Limited. It's trading at $114 a share with a $24 billion market cap, near its all-time highs. Now, if we go back to the last real crash, the crisis of 2008, 2009, this stock bottomed at $6 a share, $7 a share. Okay? After the crash, then you get all the funny money coming in, right? And then you get all the QE money coming in, and then you get more funny money coming in, QE2, QE3, QE4, and now the stock has run from $6 a share to $115 a share, near its all-time highs, and not even the coronavirus is having much of an effect on it.
Well, Swan, I can't speak for you, but I could tell you from 2000. Well, I left the country in late 2006, expecting a market crash, and then we had QE1, QE2, twist, QE3. All along, we've said that the only thing holding markets up is funny money, and I think that's pretty much been proven out. I mean, the Fed, in 2018, they tried to taper, and look what happened. We had a 20% implosion in stocks in a month, and the Fed turned around immediately and started easing and printing again.
Well, get this. All right, so now I've got McDonald's Corporation stock up. Again, another stock near its all-time high. $218 a share. Back in 2003, it was around $15 a share is where it bottomed. Again, if you look at the charts of all of these stocks, Bill, it calls to mind these stock markets, Venezuela, Zimbabwe. When you hit hyperinflation in an economy, sometimes you see the stock markets go absolutely to the moon. Now, I know that's hard to swallow in this country because there's no signs of hyperinflation yet, but I'm seeing signs of hyperinflation in these stock prices, Bill. That's really the only thing that explains it.
Yeah, exactly. You're seeing hyperinflation in stocks and in bonds. I mean, pushing interest rates down to zero mean bond prices are through the roof. So financial assets have hyperinflated, and people try to say, well, look at the CPI, look at PPI. Many of the daily goods that we use, the raw materials, they're financialized, and it's my belief that you're seeing derivatives, or you've seen derivatives just created and printed on the sell side to keep those prices down. So you're camouflaging to the ordinary man that there's actually a hyperinflation. And if you look at the definition of inflation, it's not the CPI or PPI or what prices do. It's how much money is created. And the money's already been created.
Right. I just called up a gold price history chart here, a 20-year chart, and you do see something kind of similar. It sort of resembles McDonald's until you take a look at the numbers, and instead of being up, many thousands of percent like Apple Computer.
Yeah, gold's up fivefold.
Yeah, it's up fivefold. And so, they've tried to cap the price in gold, obviously, because they want the money in the stock markets and the bond markets. But I guess the point I'm trying to make as we look at these hyperinflationary stock prices is, when does the party end? When is the game of musical chairs over and you find yourself one share short? Because typically what happens, Bill, is the smart money, the elite money, they'll get out of the stock market before this thing crashes, and they'll leave the average Joe holding the bag.
Right. That's history right there. And speaking of gold, Sean, just to illustrate the fraud, on COMEX last year, there was between 6,000 and 7,000 tons that were EFP'd from the COMEX to London. That's exchange for physical. In other words, COMEX, there's no way they could have delivered anything even close to that. And they send that to London, and that's where contracts go to die, because you can't see whether they're delivered on or not. But common sense tells you there's no way they could be delivered on. The largest hoard in the world is supposedly the U.S. with 8,300 tons. Where in the world did London come up with, in 1 year's time, 6,000 to 7,000, I think the number was 6,700 tons in 1 year's time? The world, ex-Russia and ex-China, only produces 2,500, 2,700 tons a year. I mean, common sense tells you it's a complete fraud.
Well, we know it is, and what really quantifies that for us now is watching what's happening in the palladium markets.
Right. Well, that's just a massive short squeeze.
Well, they don't have any physical. I think the LBMA is down to 25,000 ounces of physical. That's the problem. They can't paper over it because there is real demand for palladium, right, to make catalytic converters and et cetera. But there's just not enough of the stuff to make delivery. So that's...
Yeah, and you very well may see a crash in palladium, in physical palladium, simply because the auto manufacturers go into serious reverse. Because they don't have end demand, so they're not making as many cars.
Yeah. All right. Well, as we round out this conversation, I just want to remind people, I think it's kind of interesting that President Trump in the New Hampshire primary garnered, I think the count now is north of 130,000 votes, which is an all-time record for an incumbent president. Mostly, guys, usually people don't really show up, guys, for these primaries when they know their guy's going to be the nominee. So we know President Trump will be the GOP nominee moving into 2020. Why bother voting? 130,000 people, I think, showed up to cast a vote for President Donald Trump in the primary. And that dwarfs the previous high, I think, which was Bill Clinton, if memory serves, around 76,000 votes. Yeah. So what does that say about the nature of the support for this president versus what the mainstream media might tell us, Bill?
For somebody to get up, go out, and vote for somebody that already has won shows that side is pissed off.
Yeah. Well,
and Sean, I do want to mention this. I said this 2 years ago, that I thought, and I still think, it's a huge mistake for President Trump to own the stock market. And what he did yesterday with the MAGA stocks, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Apple, the $4 trillion stocks, I think that's a huge mistake, and they're definitely going to need something to point at when those things break, when everything breaks.
Yeah, I think you're right. Hey, just a thought here. It sparked. I'm on sgtreport.com, and I see this post from our friend Harley Schlanger, LaRouche Pack. A shout out to my contributor at SGT, Matt. Great guy. We're going to have him on soon to talk about his life. He's a great guy. He's in Thailand right now. He's actually born and bred in the UK. Just a terrific guy. Helps me populate SGT Report with real news every day. Anyway, Harley Schlanger's article, Dramatic DOJ Reversal in Roger Stone Case. How far will Barr go? Again, I just want to say, we'll round out the conversation by coming full circle. This is an existential battle for the soul of our nation, and it's time to choose. Do you want to be a patriot or do you want to stand with the traitors? Do you want to stand down and stand for anarchy and just let the Marxists take control of our government? Do you want the entire country to be run like California is being run, like Illinois is being run? Folks, I cannot stress upon you enough how important November is, and I will not stand down and I will not engage in infighting, because we are in an existential battle for the very soul of our nation. And I think it's very interesting to watch the Vindmans be escorted out of the White House and fired. And now they're cleaning house over at the National Security Council. 70 more people are going, all Obama holdovers. Meanwhile, the prosecutors that suggested Roger Stone should be locked up for 7 to 9 years for non-crimes, while people like James Comey run free and people like Hillary Clinton run free. I think this is just terrific now. These prosecutors have stepped down.
Yeah, all 4 of them.
So I just think it illustrates the real battle going on between this administration, at least the white hats within it, President Trump, versus the deep state, and the treacherous vipers that seek to destroy this nation and usher in a one world government and a new world order and open up our borders and destroy the whole thing.
Yeah, and I mean, you could boil it down to, do you want to hope for right and good things, or do we get everything wrong and bad things? I mean, open borders, socialism, none of it makes sense. I mean, basically everything that the left is standing for is the destruction of this nation.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And I don't think we're overstating it to say that their policies are anti-American. They're anti-human. They don't believe in self-determination. They don't believe in liberty. They want bigger government, not smaller government. They want you ruled by bureaucrats. They don't want you to have self-rule. They don't want sovereignty. They want open borders. It's basically, I said this in a previous interview, if we're going to give the White House to any one of these Marxist Democrats, you may as well elect George Soros, Bill.
I agree.
All right. Thanks so much for your time today. I always appreciate it. And we'll have to get your Zoom issues figured out, so next time we can have you back on video. Do you want to remind people where they can find your work?
Sure. You can go to www.jsmineset.com.
All right. Our guest has been Bill Holter. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Sean.
All right, friends, and thank you from the bottom of my heart. I truly, truly do love you guys. Those of you that are true supporters, especially my patrons, thank you so much. You're literally keeping us in the fight for truth and real news. You know, CNN can pay Anderson Cooper $10, $12, $13 million a year to lie. All of these people are beholden to the CFR. I'm not. I'm an independent journalist. I'm beholden to nobody. Thank you so much. And guys, for real news 24/7, you can visit us directly at SGT Report, the corporate propaganda antidote. God bless. Bye-bye.
What the cabal, the deep state, has underestimated is the degree to which the constructive, positive spirit of humanity can rise up and defeat them.